Hi everyone. Welcome to English Story School. What does it mean to conquer an empire? Is it the sword, the army, or the will of a single man? What if I told you that the greatest conqueror of all wasn't driven by power, but by something far more powerful: honor, faith, and the will to protect the innocent? This is the story of Salahuddin Ayubi, or, as history would call him, Saladin, a man who faced the greatest powers of his time and emerged as the conqueror of kings. Part 1. The Call of Destiny. In the year 1137, under the glowing stars of Tikrit, a rugged city nestled beside the Tigris River, a child was born who would one day rise not as a mere man, but as a symbol of resistance, justice, and divine purpose. His name, Salahuddin Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to the Western world as Saladin. He did not open his eyes in the halls of kings or the palaces of sultans. Instead, he took his first breath in a time of chaos, as his family fled the flames of conflict that engulfed the region. His father, Ayyub, a soldier of Kurdish descent, and his uncle, Shirkuh, were warriors forged in fire, men who taught young Saladin not only how to wield a sword, but how to hold firm to dignity and discipline, even in the face of adversity. The true birth of a leader is not in the cradle, but in the storm. From a young age, Saladin displayed a quiet brilliance. While other children played in the dust, he listened to scholars speak of justice and the life of the Prophet Muhammad, PBUH. Where others chased games, he followed discipline. His mind was sharp, but it was his heart that set him apart. He never desired glory for its own sake. He did not dream of thrones, jewels, or conquest. What stirred inside him was something more profound, a hunger for righteousness. And though he was born into an age where ambition devoured empires, Saladin would rise not by stepping over others, but by lifting his people. As he matured, his path led him into the courts of Kurdish leaders and commanders. But he remained untouched by the temptations of luxury. In grand halls where decisions of war were made, Saladin stood quietly, listening, not to flatter, but to understand. Not to command, but to serve a higher cause. Power does not lie in the sword, but in the heart of the one who wields it. Saladin. That quote would one day echo through time, but even in his early days, he lived by it. He saw the blade as a tool, not for personal victory, but for defending the weak, restoring order, and resisting tyranny. His first major rise came when the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt, weakened and fractured, called upon outside help. Under the command of his uncle Shirkuh, Saladin journeyed into Egypt, still young, still untested, but burning with an inner fire. Egypt was not a peaceful land. The court was tangled with betrayal, and the people were suffocating under oppression. But even in that political swamp, Saladin stood tall and unshaken. When Shirkuh passed away, Saladin, though barely in his 30s, was named Vizier of Egypt, a shocking decision to many. He was not the strongest warrior in the court, nor the most experienced politician, but he was known for integrity, known for compassion, known for fearlessness. At first, many doubted him. They whispered, "Who is this young Kurdish man to lead Egypt?" But soon, those whispers turned to awe. He walked the streets in disguise, listening to the people. He refused bribes, challenged corrupt officials, and fed the hungry from his own stores. His name began to spread like wildfire, not just through Cairo, but across Damascus, Jerusalem, and Baghdad. He wasn't just a vizier, he was becoming a movement. A true ruler listens more than he speaks, and gives more than he takes. In mosques, his name was whispered in prayers. Among soldiers, it became a rallying cry. Among the poor, it became a beacon of hope. But while Saladin rose with humility, Europe watched with fear. The Crusaders, mighty kings of the West, had long dreamt of controlling Jerusalem and the lands of the East. They believed their dominance was secure, their power absolute. But in Egypt, a storm was forming. A man was rising, not to conquer, but to liberate, not to destroy, but to defend the sanctity of faith and land. Saladin's leadership marked a new era. He began to unite fractured Muslim states under a single vision, one of dignity, unity, and unwavering belief. His presence transformed armies into legions of loyalty and cities into strongholds of resistance. But this was only the beginning. The real battle, the one that would echo through the centuries, was still on the horizon. A battle not of just swords and shields, but of principle and purpose, of justice versus greed, of a righteous leader versus a tide of invaders. And deep inside him, Saladin knew his life was no longer his own. It belonged to history. It belonged to a cause far greater than himself. The call of destiny had begun. Part 2. The Great Challenge. The whispers of Saladin's rise echoed far beyond the golden minarets of Cairo and the crowded bazaars of Damascus. They traveled west, crossing deserts and seas, until they reached the heavily guarded halls of Crusader strongholds. To the Crusaders, Saladin was not just a name. He was an omen, a sign that their grip on the Holy Land was slipping. And in their eyes, this Kurdish general turned sultan was not a liberator, but a threat, one that had to be extinguished before it became an unstoppable storm. Enemies fear what they do not understand, and they feared Saladin, not for his sword, but for his spirit. Among the Crusaders, the young yet formidable King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, also known as the Leper King, was one of the few who understood the depth of Saladin's vision. Baldwin saw in him not just a warrior, but a man with unwavering resolve, a leader whose cause ran deeper than borders or banners. Though disease ate away at his body, Baldwin's mind remained sharp. He realized that Saladin did not march for gold or glory. He marched for something far more dangerous to tyrants: principled justice. Jerusalem is not just a city. It is the heart of the world, and it beats for justice. Saladin. By 1187, tension had evolved into war. The world watched with bated breath as Saladin gathered his forces, not only from Egypt, but from across the Islamic world. Arabs, Kurds, Turks, and Berbers stood shoulder to shoulder under one banner, not of conquest, but of unity. This was not an army built on fear, but on belief. While the Crusader states had fortified cities and well-trained knights, they lacked something Saladin's men possessed: a shared vision of purpose. They were not mercenaries. They were men fueled by a higher calling. As Saladin set his sights on Jerusalem, the Crusaders scrambled to respond. Their lifeline to the east was weakening, and the city that had long been their spiritual jewel was now under threat. In a moment of history-defining courage, Saladin marched towards the holy city, knowing full well what stood in his path. The Battle of Hattin in July of 1187 became a turning point. Saladin, in a masterstroke of strategy, lured the Crusaders into the searing heat of the desert plains near Lake Tiberias, where their water supplies were scarce. His forces encircled them, and under the burning sun, the mighty Crusader army crumbled. Victory is not in overpowering the enemy, but in outlasting him with wisdom. Saladin captured key Crusader leaders, including Guy of Lusignan, the king of Jerusalem. And yet, in a moment that stunned even his enemies, he spared their lives. He refused to execute them as many others would have. When his soldiers brought him the true cross, a sacred Christian relic, he treated it with respect, even though it was a symbol of his enemy. Your faith is yours. Mine is mine. Let our swords speak not for hatred, but for honor. After Hattin, the road to Jerusalem lay wide open. But Saladin did not gallop in with blind rage. He knew the value of symbolism. Jerusalem was more than land. It was the pulse of three faiths. To reclaim it, he had to do so not with fire, but with grace. The siege began, but Saladin gave the defenders a chance to surrender peacefully. Inside the walls, the Crusader resistance was fierce, yet exhausted. Their hopes were shattered, their armies defeated. Still, Saladin refrained from vengeance. When Jerusalem finally surrendered in October 1187, he entered the city not as a conqueror, but as a guardian. There was no massacre, no looting. Instead, he guaranteed safety to the Christian civilians. He reopened the city's holy sites to Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike, proving to the world that his mission was not to destroy, but to rebuild. I came not to burn your temples, but to open their doors to all. The Christian world was shocked. Back in Europe, Pope Urban III, upon hearing of Jerusalem's fall, is said to have died of grief. Saladin's name now echoed through Europe's cathedrals and castles, not as a tyrant, but as a paradoxical enemy, noble, merciful, and just. But with victory came new challenges. The West, humiliated, would not stay silent for long. A new crusade was brewing, led by kings with vengeance in their hearts. Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip of France, and Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire. Saladin stood on the walls of Jerusalem, gazing out at the horizon, his city reclaimed, his people inspired. But he knew this was just the beginning. The storm was far from over, and still he whispered to himself, "Let them come with crowns. I stand with conviction." Part 3. The Battle of Hattin. It was July 3rd, 1187. The sun blazed over the arid plains near Lake Tiberias. The air shimmered with heat. The dust choked the lungs. And yet, thousands of men marched, not for land or wealth, but for Jerusalem, for destiny. On one side stood the Crusader army, armored and defiant, led by King Guy of Lusignan and Reynald of Chatillon. On the other stood Saladin, undaunted, calculating, and resolute. The world was about to witness a clash that would reshape history. In battle, the enemy's strength lies in their numbers, but a man's true strength lies in his will. Saladin. The Crusaders, desperate to relieve the siege of Tiberias, made a fateful decision to march across the dry plains with limited water through Saladin's territory. It was a move born out of arrogance and poor judgment. And Saladin? He was waiting, not with brute force, but with a plan so precise it would be studied for centuries. He controlled the water. He controlled the land. He controlled the rhythm of war. From the cliffs, his archers rained down arrows like fire. The Crusaders, clad in heavy metal, staggered in the unbearable heat. Dehydration began its silent slaughter long before any sword was drawn. Saladin's forces began encircling the enemy, not in haste, but in choreography. Every move was deliberate. Every delay was lethal. I do not rush to war. I make war rush to me. By July 4th, the Crusader army was fragmented, exhausted, and trapped near the extinct volcano known as the Horns of Hattin. Their ranks collapsed into chaos. Their banners fell one by one. Desperation took hold, and it was then that Saladin ordered the final assault. His cavalry cut through the Crusaders like a blade through dry reeds. Fires were lit in the surrounding brush, and the smoke suffocated whatever hope remained. King Guy's knights tried to form a last stand around the true cross, but their strength was long gone. One by one, They surrendered, brought to their knees not just by sword, but by strategy and the sun itself. The Battle of Hattin was over. Victory is not to be seized. It is to be earned with wisdom, restraint, and clarity of purpose. More than 20,000 Crusader soldiers lay dead, wounded, or captured. The prized True Cross, a holy relic the Crusaders believed gave them divine protection, was taken by Saladin's men. It would never return to Christian hands again. But perhaps the most defining moment came not on the battlefield, but after it. Among the captured were King Guy of Lusignan and Reynald of Chatillon. The former was shaken, yet still breathing. The latter was a different matter altogether. Reynald was notorious. He had broken truces, murdered Muslim pilgrims, and attacked caravans under Saladin's protection. His crimes weren't just against Islam. They were against humanity itself. Saladin invited the two men into his tent. He offered water to King Guy, a symbolic gesture of clemency. But when the cup was handed to Reynald, Saladin intervened. He refused to extend his mercy. For years, Reynald had spat in the face of diplomacy. Now, he would face justice. Saladin stood before him and executed him himself, calmly, with unwavering purpose. There were no theatrics, only justice. Mercy belongs to the just, but justice belongs to those who defend the innocent. King Guy, though trembling, was spared. Saladin saw no honor in killing a broken man who no longer posed a threat. It was not blood he sought, it was balance. And in that tent, with the world watching, he made it clear. His code was not of vengeance, but of virtue. Back on the battlefield, his commanders urged him to execute all remaining Crusader prisoners, fearing they might regroup and retaliate. But Saladin refused mass slaughter. He separated the Templar and Hospitaller Knights, elite fighters known for their brutality, and executed only those who were beyond redemption. The rest were either ransomed or spared. Let them return home with tales, not of my sword, but of my soul. The Battle of Hattin was not merely a tactical victory. It was a spiritual declaration. It proved that a leader could fight fiercely and still hold on to his humanity. It proved that mercy, when guided by principle, is more powerful than fear. And it showed the world that Saladin was not just a conqueror. He was a conscience in armor. From the ashes of Hattin rose a new tide. Cities across the Levant began surrendering without resistance. The Crusader states, once pillars of European dominance, now crumbled like dust in the wind. The path to Jerusalem was now wide open. Saladin didn't celebrate. He didn't boast. He stood quietly on the hill, looking over the battlefield, not with pride, but with purpose. The real battle still awaited, and he knew it. Hattin was not the end. It was the beginning of justice returning to the land. Part 4. The Reclaiming of Jerusalem. The road to Jerusalem was open, but the path was sacred. Saladin didn't rush. He didn't shout his victory. He didn't taunt his enemies. He advanced with purpose, clarity, and reverence. The city of prophets, torn apart by decades of bloodshed, was about to face a conqueror unlike any it had seen before. A conqueror is not measured by the cities he wins, but by the peace he brings afterward. Saladin. Jerusalem, once taken by the Crusaders in 1099, had been drenched in the blood of tens of thousands of Muslims and Jews. Children were slaughtered. Women were violated. Holy places desecrated. The world had not forgotten. But Saladin was not here for revenge. He was here for redemption. It was September 20th, 1187. Saladin's army began the siege of Jerusalem. But unlike the carnage of the First Crusade, this siege was driven by restraint, not rage. Balian of Ibelin, the Crusader noble who now commanded the defense of the city, expected the worst. He remembered what his own side had done 88 years earlier. He feared a massacre, but Saladin had already made a vow to himself, to his faith, and to history that no blood would be shed unnecessarily. That vow would define his legacy. For days, his forces surrounded the city. His soldiers were ready, but he delayed a full assault. Instead, he offered negotiations. Balian, seeing the hopelessness of resistance, asked for terms. Saladin could have demanded unconditional surrender. He could have burned the city to the ground. But he did something unthinkable. He offered peace. His conditions were humane, just, and unheard of for that era. No mass killings, no looting, no destruction of churches. Christian civilians would be allowed to leave peacefully. Anyone who paid a modest ransom would be free to go with dignity. Even those who couldn't afford it would be spared, because mercy was not for sale. They may call me a warrior, but I am first a servant of justice. The people of Jerusalem wept, not in fear, but in disbelief. The tales of Muslim barbarism told by the Crusaders collapsed in the face of Saladin's reality. He opened the gates of the city on October 2nd, 1187, a date that would become etched into the soul of the Muslim world. Jerusalem, after 88 years, was once again under Muslim control. There was no screaming, no fire, no river of blood, only order, only dignity. Saladin personally supervised the release of thousands of Christian captives. He forgave those who had fought against him, as long as they laid down their arms. He ordered his treasury to pay the ransoms for the poor who couldn't afford to buy their freedom. Many of his own soldiers protested. "Why should we let them go?" they asked. Saladin replied, "Because our prophet did not teach revenge. He taught us to be better when we have the power." Church bells continued to ring. The Christian holy sites were untouched. Pilgrims were still allowed to enter. Jerusalem was not silenced. It was reawakened. News of this miraculous victory spread like wildfire, not just through the Islamic world, but across Europe. Kings and bishops who had once called Saladin a savage were now sending letters praising his nobility. Even Richard the Lionheart, who would soon march in the Third Crusade, referred to Saladin as the greatest and most noble of foes. And the people of Jerusalem? They witnessed something almost impossible, a leader who did not rule through fear, but through moral power. Saladin entered Al-Aqsa Mosque for prayer, not as a king on a throne, but as a servant bowing to his creator. He ordered its restoration. He wept upon the steps. The city, bruised and broken, was now healing. "I did not come to rule Jerusalem. I came to return it to peace." He walked through the streets with no golden chariot, no roaring parade. He walked in silence, because to him, this victory was not a personal triumph. It was a divine trust. For the first time in nearly a century, Muslims, Christians, and Jews began to coexist under a banner of respect. Scholars resumed their studies. Traders reopened their shops. Children played without fear. A city that once echoed with screams now hummed with the sounds of life. The reclaiming of Jerusalem was not just a political moment. It was a spiritual revolution. Saladin had done the impossible. He had defeated his enemies and won their hearts. Part 5. The Legacy of Saladin. March 4th, 1193, Damascus. The lion had taken his final breath. Salahuddin Ayubi, the man who had once faced down empires, now lay motionless on a simple wooden bed. No royal crown, no silk robes, no golden throne, just a humble room and the silent mourning of a world that had been forever changed by his presence. When they opened his treasury to prepare for his burial, they discovered something astonishing. He had left behind no gold, no jewels, no palace to pass on. The man who had ruled Egypt, Syria, and Jerusalem had died with so little wealth that his funeral had to be paid for by others. But in truth, Saladin had left behind something far more valuable than riches. He left behind a legacy that money could never buy. He owned no land when he died, yet he ruled the hearts of millions. Saladin's strength wasn't in his sword, it was in his spirit. His greatness didn't come from fear, it came from fearlessness. He didn't create an empire of oppression. He forged a world where enemies respected him more than allies. That kind of power? It cannot be measured in gold. It can only be remembered through time. His legacy was not carved in stone. It was etched in souls. Generations after his death, both Muslims and Christians told stories of his character, not his conquests. In Europe, where he had once been labeled a Saracen devil, he became a figure of admiration. Poets, knights, and even kings spoke of his honor. Churches rang bells in his memory. Books praised his mercy. Children were named after him. Why? Because Saladin proved that a Muslim could be powerful without being brutal, proud without being arrogant, and victorious without being cruel. The West feared his army, but fell in love with his character. A man who wasn't afraid to forgive. Saladin's power lay not in vengeance, but in restraint. He forgave those who tried to destroy him. He protected those who did not follow his faith. He prayed for those who had cursed his name. That was his real jihad, the struggle to stay human when the world demanded blood. He never humiliated a defeated enemy. He never tortured for secrets. He never raised a sword against a child or a woman. And even when kings begged for revenge, Saladin gave them dignity. His example became a benchmark of ethical leadership. He was studied in military academies, admired in political science, and revered in theology. He was a warrior with a philosopher's heart, the king who walked among his people. He visited the sick with his own hands. He fed the poor without waiting for applause. He stood with orphans and wept for them. He fasted like the commoner, fought like the commander, and prayed like the servant. When his soldiers doubted, he led the charge. When his people feared, he gave them hope. When the world doubted Islam, he showed them its light through action, not argument. Leadership is not about being first. It's about making others rise with you. Saladin. His lessons still echo. Even today, in a world drowning in greed, cruelty, and hollow politics, Saladin remains a guiding star. Not because he won wars, but because he never lost himself. He taught the world that you could lead without tyranny, win without hatred, rule without corruption, die without regret. A final thought for our time. In the deserts of Syria, they still tell stories of a man who rode without fear and slept without guilt. In the alleys of Cairo, elders whisper of a ruler who never built castles, but built trust. In the mosques of Jerusalem, his name still breathes in the wind, soft, proud, eternal. A true conqueror doesn't take land. He frees the hearts of people. Saladin is not just a chapter in Islamic history. He is a reminder that justice is stronger than armies, that mercy is louder than war cries, and that one man can change the world, not by ruling it, but by inspiring it. Dove and so, with his body laid to rest in Damascus, and his legacy scattered across continents and centuries, we are left with one question. Who will be the next Saladin? With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time.